Thank you, Xenia, and dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to welcome you today to this panel on just transitions in tourism. I'm happy to discuss this topic for two reasons. One, and I think I'm speaking for all of you, I really want that tourism has a future. I believe in the power of tourism to contribute to sustainable development, to enhance global citizenship if managed well. At the same time, I'm concerned about the future of tourism, taking into account the high vulnerabilities of destinations to external shocks, the lack of local economic and political participation, and most importantly, tourism's contribution to climate change. Tourism that we have seen pre-COVID is one of the most carbon-intensive sectors in the world. Each dollar a tourist spend induces 1 kilo of carbon dioxide equivalents. The second reason why I'm very sure that this discussion is so important is a very personal one. I grew up in Dortmund, an industrial city in coal-dependent Ruhr area. I was visiting Phoenix Gymnasium, a school not named after Goethe, Gandhi or Einstein, but after this impressive mythological bird that arises from the ashes. But there was nothing mystical about it. Phoenix was just the name of the giant steelworks on the other side of the street. When I was visiting this school in the 1990s, the steelwork closed, was destructed and parts of it shipped abroad. Years before, it had become too obvious that the end of the coal age in the Ruhr area was about to come. It was just too expensive to scoop deeper and deeper to find the last ton of coal. The following transformation forced most of the parents of my schoolmates to unemployment and many of them to depressions. There were steelworkers and coal miners since generations. Today, 25 years later, Dortmund is a vibrant, creative city with a diversified economy which includes the old industries as well as knowledge-based economies, a new scene of creatives, and last not least, tourism. I'm telling this story because I see some similarities that might help us to see the current situation clearer. Carbon and the costs of climate destruction will force all sectors to change, and there's no doubt that tourism will be one of them. At the same time, I see one big difference. I deeply believe that large parts of tourism can transform inside its own economy. It has to transform from the today dominant, high-carbon, low-margin industry to a low-carbon, high-benefit and resilient economy. The vision is very clear, and I'm very happy that we can discuss this today with a panel of practitioners from Kenya, from India, from an international tour operator. But first of all, I'm happy that Stefan Gössling is with us. Well-known and well-respected researcher on sustainable tourism at Lund and Linnaeus universities in Sweden. He will underpin with his knowledge the effects of climate change on the vulnerabilities of destinations and explain why such a transformation is necessary and how. Thank you, Stefan, for being with us today. Stefan, the floor is yours. I'm happy to listen to you.
Thank you, Antje. Hello, everyone. I think I'll first of all try to move to the next slide. Yeah, that does not work just yet. Yeah, here we are. Because obviously we're in a situation that's quite spectacular. We have no tourism right now. 2 years ago, we talked about little more than over-tourism as the main issue. In this very quick and swift change between two extreme situations should be a warning sign for all of us that something is wrong in the tourism system. And obviously, when we talk about aviation as a victim right now, then we also need to bear in mind that it was because of aviation that the virus was able to spread within 24 hours, essentially, or a few weeks at the max throughout the world. So having said that, I obviously wonder what was wrong with the global tourism system that we have not seen coming, or perhaps some scientists have seen this coming, and what should be the conclusion here that we all should be talking about. I chose this picture because it's a bit exemplary of the situation that we've had which is volume growth and mass consumption, rapid consumption. You haven't been to Europe until you've visited all these 50 sites. So the discourse that we've heard very often and for a long time is that we should fly as much as we only can, often at a cost that was lower than the actual price of the kerosene that went through the aircraft taking us to destinations. We've seen disruptive market entries like Airbnb that has added capacity, increased competition, good for consumers, reduced prices, but all of that has meant that we've seen a lot of overcapacities also in aviation, because aviation does not pay the cost of climate change and it is heavily subsidized. So with the overcapacities in the system, we've also seen that profit margins have been very low. Talking about aviation again, for most of the time, in most years, aviation doesn't make a benefit or a profit because it is just such a little amount of money that the sector retains per air traveler. So the logical response by the sector has been to transport more people rather than to rethink its business model. And I think COVID-19 has exposed these vulnerabilities, and that's why we are talking about COVID right now, and hopefully even in terms of the future pandemics that we might see, or even more importantly, climate change. Why climate change? Well, personally, I see this as an analog to COVID in the sense that what could happen in the future is probably what we see right now, just a lot worse and without a vaccine. So if you look at this world map, which is a result of research that was led by Daniel Scott in Canada, that shows for 27 different indicators how runaway climate change will affect the global tourism system. Essentially, in short terms, blue is good, you will survive, and all the other colors, the red and the orange, mean that your tourism model is in danger. I don't have to explain to you what this picture means to the world map of tourism if it comes true. And the response that should be important here is obviously that we rethink our approach to global tourism, that we consider alternative models. And James Hyam and I in New Zealand have drawn up a model for this that I would like to present. We call this high value, low carbon, resilient tourism model. And what we meant here even before COVID, because this was published before COVID, is that there is now a low carbon imperative. Essentially, we need to decarbonize the global world economy by mid-century. We have another 30 years for bringing all economic sectors to zero emissions. And that means that major efforts are necessary in order to bring down emissions. And this is the starting point for everything else. Usually, most people will tell you, oh yeah, let's talk about the economy and then talk about carbon. No longer. We talk about carbon first, and then we talk about the economy. But obviously, the economy shouldn't be forgotten. So I was arguing, or we were arguing in this paper, that there's two different columns here, two pillars of the future destination model that we could discuss in this regard. The first is adding value. I think there's ample research now showing that we are not teasing out the most out of our tourism systems. Very often we are focused on the volume growth and we don't care about optimizing the system rather than to maximize it. In this new tourism model should look into adding value. And then secondly, we should look into reducing leakage. And this is important because we have a lot of leakage in our tourism model that we never discuss. We always only ever discuss a rise in arrivals. But when you think about how much money is leaking to the platform economy, with every hotel paying a 20% commission to the owners of the platforms, then I think there's a very important case to be made here in terms of retaining money within the economy. And for today's event, I have developed this model. I have tried to adjust it a little bit to the context here to make it a little bit more complex. Obviously, there is the SDGs in a wider sense and the circular economy goals that should be considered in a future destination model as well. But I think there's also an interesting case here to be made for carbon. This is because we all know that many destinations will, even in the future, be dependent on international arrivals. These international arrivals will cause carbon. But in many of the recipient countries where we go on holiday, there is an opportunity for carbon storage. There's markets for carbon. So I think we could link tourism much stronger to carbon storage in the future. And there's a second pillar here that has economic value. It's the production of synthetic fuels that we will need in order to fly in the future. And even here, I think it's a strong case to be made for many destinations to engage in the production of synthetic fuels. All of this sounds easy in theory. It will be very complex in practice, mostly because we don't have the policies in place and the support from tourism players for this new destination model that favors optimization over maximization. And I hope that today's contributions and discussions will bring us a little bit closer to the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan, for these insights. I think they will fill another discussion if we go into the details, and I'm happy to have these discussions in the future. But now I'm very happy to welcome the other esteemed panelists to this discussion. Goodbye, Stefan. I'm very proud to have a very profound group of experts with us today who bring in their expertise and their experiences from 3 continents today. First, I would like to welcome Zina. Zina Bencheikh is Intrepid Travel's Managing Director for the EMEA region, based in UK. Zina started her career with Intrepid 11 years ago and knows the company from leadership positions both on the operations side as well as the marketing and sales side. The Intrepid Group is a global adventure travel company and since 2018 the first B Corp certified travel company. Intrepid has more than 40 regional offices and operates across 130 countries. Just recently, the company was among the top 10 of most innovative tourism companies. Zina, welcome to this panel and thank you for being with us. My first question goes to you. Your company started to think about how to reduce its carbon footprint, its climate footprint, more than 15 years ago. In 2020, Intrepid even declared a climate emergency. How did your strategies change on reducing your impact on climate change over the years?
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here today. The thinking started 15 years ago. In fact, it started with one of our co-founders taking a group of senior leaders to read a book about the environmental impact of climate change, and started to brainstorm and discuss if we wanted to do something about it as an industry. We've also engaged our communities and our customers, and we made the decision to enter the very complex process to become carbon neutral by 2010, which we achieved. And this process involved, first of all, for us to understand our emissions, so measure them, and then reduce, avoid, and then offset. So in 2018, we became the largest Travel B Corp, as you mentioned, and a Travel B Corp is really a certification, a B Corp is a certification that is given to ethical companies that believe in a form of business that can be a force for good for the communities, the suppliers, the customers, but also for the environment. We realized that being in the travel industry and being carbon neutral was not enough in January 2020, that the science was pretty clear about it and that we needed to do more. And this is why we decided in January 2020 to declare a climate emergency along with Tourism Declare, which is an organization or global collective of businesses, organization, individuals who have pledged urgent action on climate change. What we have done then is presented 7-point commitments. And one of them, which probably was the highest or the biggest milestones that we've achieved since, was to publicly have a reduction target or science-based target and approved by the Science-Based Targets Initiative in October 2020, which will mean that we will start working on a roadmap to decarbonize our business in line with the 1.5 degree of the Paris Agreement by 2035.
Reduction targets mean concretely? What is the difference to your commitments before?
So it's a very, very different because it doesn't involve offsetting. It's actually a commitment to decarbonize our business. And more specifically, there are 3 different scopes of emissions without getting too technical for the audience. The scope 1 and scope 2 are emissions that we can control quite directly. So scope 1 are, for example, emissions such as business travel that we can decide not to do and replace with virtual meetings, for example. Scope 2 are emissions that are involved in what type of energy we purchase. So again, energy we purchase, for example, for our offices, like electricity, etc. While scope 3 are emissions that are about our supply chain, value chain. And so they are more indirect, but we still can have a control on them. So what we've committed is to reduce scope 1 and scope 2 emissions by 71% by 2035 and reduce scope 3 emissions, so the value chain, by 56% for the same period of time.
Okay, wow, that's impressive. And we will talk a little bit later about how to implement this along the supply chain. At this point of time, I'm very happy to welcome Judy to our group. Welcome, Judy. Judy Kepher-Gona is founder and executive director of Sustainable Travel and Tourism Agenda from Kenya. Judy has over 20 years experience in promoting a better and inclusive form of tourism. Listing all her awards would implode our session and the time we have. But I want to mention that Judy was the winner of the Forbes Woman Africa Sustainable Citizen Award. She's an inspiring leader and pioneer in sustainable tourism in Africa, as she was convening the first Sustainable Tourism Africa Summit in 2015, an event that now is going in its 7th year. Judy, it is our pleasure to have you with us today. Kenya is well known for 2 quite different tourism models. One is the wildlife-based tourism inside the country, and the other is the beach-focused leisure tourism at the coast. How are these 2 types of tourism affected directly now by the crisis like COVID?
Thank you very much, Antje. Let me start by reiterating, first of all, the opportunities that are created by these 2 forms of tourism. Wildlife-based tourism has got a lot of benefits that it brings to the communities around it. We know that wildlife tourism in Kenya takes place around communal lands, and some of it is actually taking place on communal lands. So employment for communities. It offers, it supports small enterprises by communities, like supports to cultural centers, supports to community cultural businesses like beadworks by women. It supports education through bursaries. It supports healthcare through provision of clinics. It also supports household income, where this tourism or wildlife conservancies are actually based on communal land. So these benefits of wildlife tourism to the people living around conservation areas is very significant, to the extent that their lives almost evolve around it. So when COVID happens for a place like this, you know that the first thing that is hit very hard is their household income, because most people are working in the tourism industry, they're working in the camps and lodges, they're working as guides, they're providing services to the industry, and they are responsible for household incomes. So household income was hit hard by COVID-19 in wildlife tourism. But when it comes to nature, we also know that wildlife protection was affected. Wildlife protection was affected because tourism brings in the revenue, pays the scouts and the rangers that protect wildlife. When tourism was not here, a lot of conservation areas and others reduced the salaries that were available. On this, or not salaries, maybe the numbers of scouts that they would have the money for management of conservation areas was not, so patrol activities were not as active. So protection of wildlife was affected during this time. There were risks of increased human-wildlife conflict because, again, the management and patrols of going out were not there. Overall, it will be okay and convenient, right, to say that the pandemic affected the quality of life for communities living around wildlife tourism areas. The same goes for coastal tourism, which offers employment to the local people. A lot of employment in the high season. You've got a lot of people who are employed as seasonal workers. Then you've got the long-term permanent employees. Then you've got all the artisan fishermen who supply all these coastal hotels with fish on a daily basis. You've got some other supply chains of farmers and fruits that come from these communities. All this dried up during the pandemic. And so again, as in wildlife tourism, you saw that household income was affected adversely for the families that are dependent or where the breadwinners are dependent on tourism employment for their household income. So overall, COVID-19 affected the quality of life, both for wildlife tourism areas and the coastal destinations.
Towards climate change, is there the difference between these two kinds of tourism products and their effectiveness?
Yes, I wouldn't say there is a difference, but they are all vulnerable to climate change in different ways. When you look at the savannas where wildlife tourism happens, you would be thinking about situations of extreme drought. Extreme drought and heat have their implications on vegetation. This can affect quality of pasture and availability of pasture, because we also know that where wildlife tourism happens is the communities in these areas are pastoralists, so they depend on livestock. And there is always continuous competition for pasture between livestock and wildlife. Now, with climate change, these risks are even increased, and these vulnerabilities are increased when there is a change in vegetation, when now you have less pasture in a year because you probably have less rainfall or you have too much rainfall, and the right pasture cannot be found for the wildlife and for the livestock. So there is concentration of both livestock and wildlife in small areas. Now, this contributes to another problem. You end up with a problem of erosion. When we ended up with a problem of erosion, the quality of land, even to produce crop and food for the local communities, is impacted. So it's a spiral effect. Climate vulnerabilities have spiral effect on wildlife destination. The same happens to our coastal destinations. When there is a risk of rising sea levels and hotels have to be closed, there's again loss of jobs and loss of livelihoods.
Okay,
even
thank you,
for the
Judy.
fishermen who depend on the sea to supply to the tourism.
Thank you, Judy, for taking us to Kenya and giving us insights on the current situation and the effectiveness by climate change and COVID. I last but not least want to get Joyatri in this round. Joyatri Rai is the Director of Equations, Equitable Tourism Options from India, a research and campaign and advocacy organization that advocates for just, equitable and democratic tourism development. Equation is a highly respected advocate for transformation of tourism with great connections both to grassroots as well as a dialogue partner to the industry and the public sector. Welcome, Joyatri, on our stage. I think there are some similarities from your experience to what Judy just told. But looking at specifically at India, which has a big population and a very mobile population. I'm wondering, how is it possible to increase the positive effects of tourism and reducing the damage, for example, in rural areas, when more and more people are traveling also for leisure reasons in India?
Thank you, Antje, and this is really a great opportunity for us. So let me start by saying that tourism is one of the sectors that we're all aware that it has been negatively impacted, and any kind of disaster that actually impacts tourism sector quite a bit. But this time, the vulnerable nature of tourism was exposed in a great detail. We have seen that the structural faultiness that actually tourism has got magnified as the contractual as well as the informal labor in the industry lost their jobs in the first month of the pandemic lockdown itself. So the entire workforce got completely scattered. They did not really have anything to fall back on. On the other hand, the sector is vulnerable to extreme events, which is true, but it is also the unsustainable tourism development that is also plays a role of the villain, which makes the ecosystem as well as the communities more and more vulnerable. So this is an opportunity that we rethink and we rebuild tourism. So the questions that is really, as we see and what has been posed is that, does tourism allow for a more diversified understanding of what livelihood means? Does it really have a holistic approach in terms of taking livelihood from within its own sphere of influence? Or does it allow the diverse livelihoods, a set of livelihoods to actually coexist? So we don't really make the entire economy of the tourism location dependent on tourism rather than try and embrace what is already there and try and build on it. In what way can tourism trigger the kind of economy that's already in the place and contribute to the local economy in relation to the economic activities as well as the social and cultural activities? Now, if you look at these questions, then the tourism to be more inclusive, sustainable, as well as resilient, and what we were talking about positive, it needs to consider community as the primary stakeholder. And it has to consider, and it has to be deeply embedded in the community's well-being. And when I say community's well-being, it means all three factors of economic, social, as well as economic. How do we look at that? And how tourism can actually embed that into its promotion, marketing, planning, as well as decision-making. Other important factor that we really see is to facilitate this process, we need strong linkages with the local government to bring the decentralized governance in tourism in terms of managing as well as regulating tourism at the destination level. With the capacity enhancement at various levels of tourism is an absolute necessity. We see that the way the tourism is built today, it seems like the community and the community resources are completely owned by the tourism sector. But we have to rethink about it and understand that community owns those resources. And how do we make sure that the community, by owning it and by being responsible, integrates tourism into it? Mm-hmm. The role of the local...
I think okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, and the last point to mention is really the opportunity is right now to look at a quality-based tourism than a quantity-based tourism, and that's where the entire difference will really come.
I think realistically, it's very important that we are talking about a transformation in a living environment. So in a system that already exists. So it's not about building tourism from the scratch in an ideal world, but to transform what we have today and make it better. So I'm wondering if we take into account the leave no one behind principle that is core of the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development. What does this mean? Who needs to get special attention to not be left behind in such a transformation process? Joyatri, maybe a short answer if possible.
Yeah, I'll try. I think what we are seeing is there are two parts of this story of leave no one behind for communities. One is looking at primary occupations of the destination rather than transforming the economy to be completely dependent on tourism. That's one principle. If we look at, then we're actually talking about community that's affected by tourism, and to see how they can be part and parcel of this development. So we have seen that the reverse migration that happened in India, it is witnessed that the entire, it has thrown open whole question of saying that how do we really restore the primary economy of those places, which has completely been, dependent now, completely be changed into tourism dependent. Another part of it is to look at people who are already employed in tourism, which actually, Judy has very rightfully, mentioned it, that what would they do? How do you really skill them? What kind of opportunities are there? What kind of small businesses can they set up? The kind of resources that we already have in the place, in that particular location, can we really, rather than having investments into more into infrastructure, can we ensure that what infrastructure we already have, built on the social as well as the material infrastructure, to actually transition this process of tourism today, rather than building and bringing in more and more resources, which is not really may not be required.
Yes, thank you very much, Joyatri. Judy, this goes to you. What about, for example, the hotel workers that are working since decades in the large hotels at the coast? What support is needed to help them to cope the transformation that will also be pushed by climate change?
I think the whole COVID situation is a call to the tourism industry to also start thinking about reskilling the industry. There's so many people who have worked in the tourism industry and only know how to do one thing in that industry. They know how to make a room. And if you take them out of making a room, they have lost their life. They cannot do anything else. We need to start rethinking skills in the tourism industry right from our training institutions, that people leaving tourism training institutions should be multi-skilled to be able to do several things and not just one or two things. And even when they work in this industry, they should be exposed to different skills within the industry. Today, we are not talking about just recruiting or acquiring talent. We are talking about acquiring talent, developing talent, retaining that talent, and building that talent so that they can thrive outside of your facility, outside of where they have been working. So it's about acquiring talent in tourism, developing that talent in tourism, trying much to retain it so that they can grow. There's a lot of wastefulness of human skills in the tourism industry, where people are in and out of positions for seasons throughout the year. So throughout the year, you are on standby. You work for 6 weeks, you go off for 2 months. You come and work for 2 months, you go off for another 3 months. You come and work again. So you are on and off work throughout the year, doing a little bit of everything here and there. There is no time for that organization, tourism organization, to develop, to invest in the development of that talent so that they can grow and they are able to do much more than the short-term work that they do within the hotel industry. So you find that in coastal destinations like Kenya, their whole generation, somebody has worked in the hotel industry for 30 years, and all these 30 years, they have been working on seasonal part-time employment. They come for this, just like what I have described. It is not a sustainable way of developing a community and giving back to a people, and hope that these people can be developed in themselves so that they can be good and resourceful to their families who are dependent on them.
I think that's an important point also to give to Zina. So your headquarter commitments also mean that your DMCs, your local suppliers, have to commit and fulfill to your commitments. So I'm wondering how you are getting your stakeholders, your suppliers, your supply chain on board. I think that has a lot to do also with skill development, cultural dialogues to understand the local situation. So maybe you could explain a little bit how you get the supply chain on board for this transformation.
Completely, because if we want to achieve our very ambitious targets, we need the commitment of the supply chain, as I mentioned earlier. And this will involve, obviously, our network of destination management companies that are the ones who look after our supply chains in the different locations where we operate trips. So one of the most important points would be around that education and awareness piece. In a lot of destinations where we operate, there is very poor awareness and understanding of the whole climate emergency situation. And we have a responsibility first to train, educate, and support our existing suppliers to understand how can they do better, how can they improve the way they manage their operations so they can have a much lower impact. And also for us in our team, and mostly our contracting team, educate them as well as train them to contract with new suppliers as we grow that are much more dedicated and much more working toward the similar targets than us. So that is definitely a very good point. And also, as I mentioned earlier, we are going to we are committing to go to 100% renewable energy for all our offices, which also include our DMCs in the different part of the world where we operate. Our office in London is already 100% renewable energy, but that's something that is probably much more easy to achieve in a place like the UK than maybe it is in a developing area of the world.
Thank you, Zina. We would have so much more to discuss. Unfortunately, the time is running out. I would just ask you finally, do you think this crisis will force the industry to get more resilient and more sustainable in the future, or is it only in your surrounding where you are active? So maybe you can show with your thumb vote where you think the tourism industry is standing in 2030 in regard to the resilience towards climate disasters and other external shocks. Are you optimistic or pessimistic that tourism will change for the better?
There's no other choice.
Okay, yeah, this would be a complex question, I see. So we would need more space to discuss, not today at ITB. So I'm very happy to thank you very much and to hand over to Xenia and the ITB program for today.